Hello everybody, and welcome to another uncanny episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This topic was voted on by Patreon supporters. If you would also like to contribute to the channel and vote in monthly polls, you can sign up for $1 per month over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelate. The link is in the description below. Today's tale begins with the psychic leader of the X-Men, Professor Charles Francis Xavier. I'm sure most Marvelites are familiar with this powerful mutant telepath, but if you'd like to know more about his origins, I already have a separate video on the channel linked in the description below as well. Xavier, of course, is a man who fought valiantly for mutant rights and longed for a peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants. But like most people, Xavier sometimes had darker thoughts that he refused to act on. The temptation to use his abilities to subjugate others and gain wealth and influence. Xavier suppressed this darker side of himself, burying it within his own psyche. But it wouldn't stay buried forever. Things really got started here when an alien entity attempted to establish telepathic contact with Xavier. This alien was actually Lilandra Neramani, a member of the Shi'ar royal family who would later become allies and lovers with the Professor. But the important thing for today's story is that the initial contact between them caused a great deal of mental anguish for Xavier. This manifested as vivid, overwhelming nightmares of a violent conflict in deep space. At the same time, Xavier was staying with his old friend and former lover, Moira McTaggart. A concerned Moira gave Charles a sedative to help him sleep and keep the nightmares at bay. But that lowered Xavier's psychic defenses, allowing his repressed dark side to emerge as a psionic being. This dark Xavier, in turn, created illusory duplicates of the original X-Men, Angel, Iceman, Beast, and Marvel Girl, who attacked the then-current team of Banshee, Nightcrawler, Storm, Wolverine, and Cyclops. The ensuing battle ended when the real Xavier awakened and dispelled the psionically created imposters. The Dark Xavier, having developed a mind of his own, was a bit more difficult to dispatch, but he was ultimately defeated when the Professor created his own psychic projections of the original X-Men. Xavier reabsorbed his dark side, and once again it was kept at bay, trapped inside his mind. But after that, the darkness began attempting to reassert itself while Xavier slept. While it wasn't strong enough to manifest a physical form on Earth, it was able to project itself into the seemingly subatomic reality known as the Microverse. Known in this form as the entity, Dark Xavier quickly grew powerful, possibly by drawing from the microversal energy known as the Enigma Force, and inhabiting a living body. The shape that it took reflected the psychic armor that Xavier previously used in a telepathic battle against the Shadow King. Since it was at its strongest while Xavier slept, as the entity grew more powerful, it kept Xavier asleep more and more. On the edges of the Microverse proper, it devastated many populated frontier worlds. This onslaught on their reality even forced the heroic Micronauts to join forces with their nemesis, the tyrannical Baron Karza. However, this union was still not enough, and the entity telepathically enslaved the Micronauts. Meanwhile, Karza tracked his foe's origins to Earth, where he confronted the X-Men. Things only got messier from there, with the entity using the Micronauts to attack the X-Men while dressed in the uniforms of the original team. Both groups were brought back to the Microverse and used by the entity in his conquests. Then the young X-Man, Kitty Pryde, was possessed by Baron Karza, and the dark entity tried to seduce her. Although his body was asleep, the real Xavier was able to protect Kitty by mentally dragging the entity's spirit into a battle on the astral plane. This left the entity's physical body vulnerable, and the Karza-possessed Kitty literally stabbed it in the back. Its astral form survived, but when it tried to inhabit Xavier's body, the Professor seemingly induced a stroke to kill them both. While this was in actuality another psychic illusion, the entity fled back to its own body, not realizing it was already dead. That specific incarnation of Xavier's dark side faded out of existence, but of course darkness and negativity, although suppressed, still existed within him, as it does in all men. Of course, not every man represses their darker urges as Xavier did, and some men use their anger and hate in the pursuit of a righteous cause. Never has this been more evident than with the man who has been both Xavier's closest friend and fiercest enemy, Magneto. Over the years, Magneto's brutal methods caused the deaths of many humans, and eventually the governments of the worlds implemented a countermeasure. The planet was surrounded by an electromagnetic mesh in an attempt to neutralize Magneto's mutant power. But from his orbital headquarters above the field, Magneto was unaffected, and he set off a global magnetic pulse to destroy the mesh. But this also caused blackouts and devastation across the planet, resulting in hundreds of deaths. Using a Shi'ar exoskeleton to walk, Xavier led the X-Men in a counterattack on Magneto. In the ensuing battle, Wolverine was badly injured when Magneto ripped the metal from his skeleton. Having been pushed to the edge, Xavier finally decided to stop his rival once and for all, reaching into his mind and shutting it down. In Xavier's own words, he took away Magneto's greatest weapon, his hatred and ego. But perhaps he didn't realize that there was an amount of literalness in that statement. While Xavier did this, Magneto's own dark ego temporarily manifested as an astral being. Reaching out while the two men were still connected, it invisibly touched Xavier, leaving a piece of itself inside. And so anger, grief, and vengeance from Magneto fused with Xavier's suppressed dark emotions, and from them, a new intelligent psionic entity began gestating within him. And further pain and tragedy only served to strengthen this new being. Rising hatred against mutant kind, multiple deaths related to the legacy virus, Xavier's inability to rehabilitate the psychotic Sabretooth, all of this allowed the psionic creature to feed and grow. Things reached a tipping point when a young mutant named Dennis Hogan was lynched by a bigoted mob of angry humans on the edge of Xavier's school grounds. This, it seems, was the final straw, and the dark entity growing within Xavier awakened, taking the name Onslaught. On some level, Onslaught believed in Xavier's dream of peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants, but was willing to go to extreme lengths to achieve it. He apparently began plotting to link every mind on Earth into a single collective intelligence, eliminating independent thought. He intended on accomplishing this by using warp portals used by Landau, Luckman, and Lake, an interdimensional holding firm that Xavier was familiar with. But first, he would gather power by spreading terror and increasing the amount of psychic activity for him to feed on. Taking over Xavier's body, he manifested a large psionic armor inspired by Magneto's costume. Fittingly, he also possessed the mutant powers of both Professor X and Magneto. He attempted to recruit Xavier's stepbrother, Cain Marco, the Juggernaut, to his cause. But when Marco refused to join him, Onslaught magnetically threw him all the way from Vancouver on the west coast of Canada to New Jersey. The X-Men found the Juggernaut, who warned them about the new villain, but Onslaught forced him to forget that he was really Charles Xavier. Onslaught also decided to use robots in his plans, specifically the kind that had so often clashed with the X-Men, the Sentinels. Although designed to hunt mutants, the Sentinels had the capacity to absorb and store psionic energy, making them the perfect tool for Onslaught. Now, this dark persona wasn't able to inhabit Xavier's body all of the time, and it seems the professor was unaware of what was happening. But he soon had an encounter with a mutant named Nate Gray, which would have lasting consequences. Better known as X-Man, Gray came from the altered Age of Apocalypse timeline, where he was created by the mad scientist Mr. Sinister using genetic material from Cyclops and Jean Grey. As such, he also had powerful psionic abilities. When the professor tried to investigate in his invisible astral form, X-Man sensed his presence and was able to pull him out of the astral plane. While Xavier ultimately escaped and returned to his body, the experience of having his psionic form manifest in physical reality taught Onslaught how to do the same. But although he was able to escape Xavier's mind and act independently, the two were still connected on a metaphysical level. He subsequently sought to use other mutants as pawns or tools in his plan to disseminate his hyper-psionic energy. For example, he forced the teleporter Gateway to help him kidnap Chamber, a mutant whose body was basically a shell containing his own psionic energy. More notably, Onslaught recruited a mutant called Post to serve as his herald. Originally a CIA operative named Kevin Tremaine, despite his enhanced strength, he was grievously injured on a mission to China after being captured and experimented on by the international crime lord known as the Mandarin. He was rescued by the time-traveling freedom fighter Cable, who saved his life with a blood transfusion. However, this caused him to be infected with a techno-organic virus that had already claimed Cable's arm. Cable brought Tremaine back to the United States to meet with Xavier, but Onslaught recruited him instead. Onslaught used the techno-organic virus in his system to endow him with cybernetic enhancements, transforming Kevin Tremaine into Post. Post then served as a prelude to Onslaught's coming and was dubbed his herald. He was sent to battle the X-Men as a test of their abilities, which they passed when they worked together to defeat him. He was also ordered to eliminate Cable, who Onslaught saw as a potential threat, and while Post beat him nearly to death, he refused to deliver the finishing blow. Others recruited into Onslaught's service and enhanced by him included Mimic, the Blob, and Holocaust, the son of Apocalypse from X-Man's timeline. The latter was sent to abduct X-Man, but ultimately failed to deliver. And all of that was done before any of the X-Men had any idea who or what Onslaught really was. His psionic form was finally revealed when he pulled Jean Grey into the astral plane to confront her. Because of Jean's experience with the cosmic power known as the Phoenix Force and her own telepathic abilities, Onslaught tried to convince her to join with him. He brought her into Xavier's mind, exposing dark secrets and repressed memories. In particular, he revealed long-forgotten feelings the Professor had towards Jean in the early days of the X-Men. Of course, Xavier never acted on these feelings in any kind of inappropriate way. He buried them and forgot about them like every other dark or negative emotion he'd had in his adult life. An entire lifetime of repressed feelings, angers and fears, passions and prejudices, sins and shames. However, Jean resisted Onslaught's attempts to corrupt her and was cast back into the physical world. Following this, she brought the Juggernaut to a psi-shielded chamber beneath the X-Mansion. There, she unlocked his full memories of his own encounter with Onslaught and learned who their foe really was. In a panic, the Juggernaut tried to flee but was found and caught by the psionic monster. Onslaught ripped the Crimson Gem of Cyttorak, the source of the Juggernaut's power, out of his chest and trapped his mind inside of it. Onslaught next set his sights on a powerful mutant with reality-shaping abilities, Franklin Richards, the son of Reed Richards and Susan Storm. Otherwise known as Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman of the world-famous superhero family, the Fantastic Four. Onslaught created a psychic projection of a young boy named Charlie who introduced himself to Franklin. Meanwhile, he took full control of Xavier and called the X-Men to him, intending on leading them in a war against humanity. The heroic mutants of course refused, and Onslaught revealed its massive psionic form to them. It attempted to destroy them, but the X-Men were saved by Bishop's energy-absorbing abilities. While he decided to let them live, Onslaught did find a new servant for himself, a dark version of Beast originating from the same altered timeline that had spawned X-Men and Holocaust. With the magnitude of the threat levied against them, the heroes began assembling their forces, with Nate Gray convincing the Avengers to aid the X-Men. After learning of Onslaught's interest in Franklin Richards, several heroes went to stand with the Fantastic Four against him. However, the psionic monster successfully mesmerized and abducted Franklin. Seeking to keep his enemies occupied, Onslaught mentally controlled the Incredible Hulk and sent him to attack Cable. After that, all hell broke loose when he dispatched his army of Sentinel robots to attack New York City. The situation quickly became dire, but the Avengers and the Fantastic Four stood ready to fight alongside the X-Men to combat it. While the Sentinels battled heroes across the city, Onslaught gained access to Franklin's reality-shaping powers by absorbing him into his being. He then erected a massive citadel in Central Park directly above a large underground warp portal. He then demonstrated his strength by setting off a telekinetically enhanced electromagnetic pulse that shook the entire city. From within the psionic monster, Franklin Richards was compelled to reach out telepathically to Nate Gray for help. This, however, was a trap set by Onslaught, who captured X-Man and gained his power as well. With the combined abilities of 4 powerful mutants, Onslaught was stronger than ever and began growing into a twisted new form. However, Franklin continued to resist from within and even made contact with Xavier within the monster's mind. Outside in the physical world, the X-Men and the Avengers confronted Onslaught together. The monster taunted the heroes, boasting that he would kill Xavier for he no longer needed him to exist. Thor decided to test this theory using his mighty hammer Mjolnir to tear through the creature and free the Professor. The two were indeed separated completely, and theoretically without Xavier's mind to continue projecting him, Onslaught should have faded out of existence. However, he had grown so strong that he could continue to persist within his armored form without the Professor to sustain him. More dangerous than ever, Onslaught unleashed a psionic storm and returned to his citadel. Cable then joined forces with the ancient mutant Apocalypse in an attempt to retrieve Franklin from Onslaught's psionic armor. That plan failed when Apocalypse tried to kill Franklin instead of saving him, and was stopped by the Invisible Woman. Regardless, the attempt restored Franklin's hope, and he attempted to reach out to his parents with his power. Onslaught seized the energy generated by this and twisted it into phantoms of the Fantastic Four's greatest enemies. The FF defeated these foes with aid from their friends and allies, including Namor the Submariner, the Inhuman Royal Family, and even Doctor Doom, who stood beside them to oppose Onslaught. Iron Man and the Black Panther, meanwhile, developed vibranium-enhanced psi shields to help the Avengers withstand their enemies' psychic power. Throughout all of this, they still had to contend with Onslaught's sentinels hunting them. Holocaust and Post were also sent to deal with the heroes, but they were defeated as well. By this point, Onslaught's goals had seemingly shifted, as he told Nate Gray that he planned to destroy humanity and give mutants dominion over the Earth. However, when he probed Gray's mind, he saw that in the timeline that he came from, mutants were the dominant species, and yet the world still fell into ruin. Shortly after that, Xavier approached Onslaught in a last-ditch effort to reason with him and end the threat peacefully. But the monster declared that neither human nor mutant were worthy of life, and that neither would survive the onslaught. The X-Men soon arrived to save the Professor, but were unable to stand up to their foe's psionic might alone. But then, just as all hope seemed lost, backup arrived. While Onslaught was a creature of darkness and hate, that day he was opposed by the forces of courage and hope, as the Avengers, the Fantastic Four, and their allies arrived to aid the X-Men. It was truly a sight to marvel at. But even with such a collection of heroes, the battle would not be an easy one. In fact, Onslaught threatened to end all life on Earth when he began growing a second sun in the sky. Taking charge, Cyclops sent Storm and Thor to minimize the damage and prevent them all from being killed. Others combined their powers as well, with Wolverine, Giant Man, and Namor ripping open Onslaught's force barrier so that a merged Vision and Rogue could strike at him. However, even this did no physical damage to their foe's hardened armor. In a desperate gambit, the Hulk had Jean Grey telepathically shut down the part of his brain that was Bruce Banner. The full force of his seemingly limitless strength unleashed, the Hulk attacked Onslaught, with both opponents only growing stronger by their boundless rage. As the psychic storm swirled around the battle, the other heroes pushed forward in an attempt to help. When they reached the center, they found that the Hulk had been physically split from Bruce Banner, but Onslaught's armor had been destroyed. However, the monster had evolved. By this point, he'd become a being of pure psychic energy that no longer required a physical form of any kind to persist. In fact, without one, he was now free to spread across the entire planet. Willing to sacrifice himself to prevent this, Thor leapt forward and used his godly abilities to trap Onslaught within his own body. But even he was not strong enough to hold the monster alone. With all life on Earth hanging in the balance, the Thing and the Human Torch also jumped into the psionic maelstrom to share the burden. More and more heroes jumped in to help contain the monster, including Captain America and the mighty Avengers, all willing to sacrifice their lives to save the world. The plan was working. With Thor and the human heroes containing him, Onslaught was growing weaker. The X-Men, however, needed to remain outside since Mr. Fantastic deduced that Onslaught would have been able to feed on their mutant powers. He and Cyclops came up with a plan, knowing that the human heroes would not survive. While Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman also leapt in to help weaken Onslaught, the X-Men attacked with everything they had. As Onslaught's essence dissipated, Nate Gray and Franklin Richards were rescued and both survived. The day was saved and Onslaught was destroyed, but of course the battle against him would have notable consequences. Most obviously, the Avengers and the Fantastic Four were seemingly killed, sacrificing themselves to weaken and contain Onslaught long enough for him to be defeated. But it was while that was happening when Franklin and X-Man were freed from within Onslaught. Before the spirits of the heroes completely vanished from the Earth, Franklin made contact with his mother. In that moment, his hope for them to survive persevered, causing his powers to warp reality. This gave birth to a pocket universe, another reality similar but different to the one we know, a counter-Earth where the heroes were reborn. There were similarities between this world and the one the heroes came from, but many differences as well. For example, on Counter-Earth, the role of Captain America's sidekick Bucky was taken up by a young girl named Ricky Burns, who was created along with the pocket reality. Meanwhile, on the normal Earth, Baron Zemo took advantage of the vacuum left behind by the missing heroes to craft heroic false identities for himself and several other supervillains, forming the first incarnation of the Thunderbolts. However, the existence of Counter-Earth was later discovered, and the real heroes eventually returned, passing through the alien universe known as the Negative Zone. There is, of course, more that could be said about the circumstances surrounding those events, like the involvement of the Celestials, but perhaps those details are best left for another time. There's also the fact that, as I mentioned, during his battle against Onslaught, the Hulk was physically separated from Bruce Banner, allowing both to exist as two distinct beings. Banner was then among the humans who helped hold Onslaught's psionic energy form in place, and thus was reborn on Counter-Earth with the others, where he was transformed into a different version of the Hulk. The Hulk he split from eventually found Banner when he and Spider-Man were transported to Counter-Earth, which led to them discovering that the other heroes were still alive as well. When they all returned to the original Earth, the heroes regained their true memories and the two Hulks merged into one being yet again. Then years later, there was another incident involving both the X-Men and the Avengers, the House of M. We talked about those events on the channel before, so I won't go into detail about them here, but if you want to know more, I'll link a video with the relevant information in the description below. The important thing for today is that at the end of that conflict, in a fit of madness, Wanda Maximoff, the Scarlet Witch, cast a spell which depowered most of the Earth's mutant population. Among those affected were Professor Xavier and Magneto, the latter of which having long since recovered from the telepathic shutdown that Xavier had performed on him years prior. It's not entirely clear whether what I'm about to describe was intentionally induced by the Scarlet Witch, or if it was merely an unforeseen consequence of Xavier and Magneto being depowered at the same time, but in either case, the impossible happened. Somehow, the dissipated psionic energy that made up Onslaught was either drawn back together or recreated, and the monster was reborn. Furthermore, this incarnation of Onslaught wanted revenge on Franklin Richards. Possessing Mr. Fantastic, the monster tried to strike at Franklin in his own home, but the boy created a duplicate pocket reality of Counter-Earth and escaped into it. Onslaught pursued him there, but the boy was rescued and aided by Ricky Burns. The Ricky from the previous Counter-Earth was killed on another adventure in the intervening years, but was resurrected when Franklin created this new Counter-Earth. He also created duplicates of the Avengers and the Fantastic Four based on their previous Heroes Reborn incarnations. Hero and villain alike defended Franklin against Onslaught, including that reality's version of Hawkeye, who Franklin had created to be a duplicate of his world's Wolverine, complete with knowledge of their foe. Ultimately, it was Ricky Burns who saved the day, seemingly sacrificing herself to force Onslaught into the negative zone between the two realities. While the monster remained trapped there, Ricky subsequently emerged on Franklin's original Earth. Taking the name Nomad, she joined forces with other teenage heroes as a member of the Young Allies. However, it seems that Onslaught was the one responsible for her return as a part of another plot. While the two were both in the negative zone, Onslaught found a portal to Earth, but one that was closing quickly. Unable to pass through himself, he consumed Ricky with his essence and sent her through instead, tethering himself to his home reality. By sending her vivid nightmares, he manipulated her into investigating a deadly power source in the Colombian rainforest. The Young Allies joined forces with a secret Avengers team led by Steve Rogers and found a facility that was drawing energy from the negative zone. And so Onslaught possessed Nomad in an attempt to return to Earth once again. The heroes were able to stop him, at least temporarily, with a focused electromagnetic pulse. But he was still connected to Ricky and could use her to return again. And so Ricky again sacrificed herself, convincing her teammate Gravity to use his powers to destroy her, shredding her body apart and killing Onslaught along with her. Now, this may not truly be the end of Onslaught, with the character returning in 2021's X-Men The Onslaught revelation, but I'm about out of time for this video, so for now I'll leave you guys to experience that story for yourself. But at the very least, you should now have some good understanding of the villain's somewhat convoluted history. But that is indeed all I've got for you today, so if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, share the video, and subscribe for more marvelous content. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me, including my Patreon page where for only $1 a month you can get your name in these special thanks here. So until next time, true believers, Excelsior!